Here Be Dragons is a podcast of Christ City Church in Vancouver, BC, Canada. Here, we'll aim to talk about what it means to faithfully follow Jesus in our post-Christian context, all with the aim of making missional disciples for the sake of the neighborhood. If you'd like to know more about Christ City Church and get connected to a neighborhood church, you can email info@christcitychurch.ca. Well, welcome to this episode of Here Be Dragons. My name is Jake LeFave. I'm a pastor here at Christ City Church, and I'm joined today for the third time by Dr. Quentin Genuis. We've given Quentin's credentials before. We don't need to do that again. Frankly, I can't remember them all. But Quentin is a doctor here in Vancouver. He's a member at Christ City Church, South Vancouver. He's a friend of the podcast, third time appearance. And actually, Quentin, before we get into it today, and before we talk about what we're talking about, you were recognized because you were on the podcast.
That's right. I'm very grateful to be back with you today in Here Be Dragon Studios. And I was telling you, as you know, before we were online, this is a true story. And I want to say that this is the only time I've ever been recognized in public for any work that I've done. And I was riding BC ferries, trying to keep all of my children in my sights and from falling off the edge. And a stranger came up to me and said, "Are you the guy who was on Here Be Dragons podcast?" And it was a big moment for me. And
we have global reach. Global reach, big in Japan. This is the annual podcast of Christ City Church. It's a quality, not quantity kind of situation. That's so funny to hear that you're recognized.
Yeah, but I'm very grateful to be back, especially if it's only annual,
Fantastic.
I'm a frequent guest.
Perfect. Today we're talking about, on a more serious note, the issue of addictions. Addictions is something that we're very familiar with. Most cities are very familiar with, but particularly here in Vancouver, because of obviously the opioid crisis spanning our province, very much so now, not just here in Vancouver. But really, Quentin, we'd love to talk today with you about how you've come to speak into this world of addictions. Your experience working with men and women who've experienced addiction on the downtown east side at St. Paul's and in other places. And so maybe just start us off today by letting us in to how you got involved in this world of speaking as an authority of some sort on addictions and what hope people have, not just as a doctor, but as a follower of Jesus. And so maybe just kind of welcome us into this topic as it, kind of entered your life.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to be speaking and thinking and writing about this issue these days. To be totally honest, my initial foray into thinking about addiction came somewhat reluctantly. I moved to Vancouver to do a fellowship, a residency year in emergency medicine that was at St. Paul's. And at that time, I hadn't thought a lot about St. Paul's as being the hospital that had a unique relationship with the downtown east side community. And St. Paul's has been described as ground zero of the overdose crisis or opioid epidemic, or whatever language you prefer for what's going on. And as a resident, I then began to encounter the scale of the human tragedy, and also felt a lot of moral distress about how little it felt like we were doing for persons. And the first thing I always want to say about the addictions crisis, that's not just opioids, but that's many issues in our society, is that it matters so gravely because persons matter so deeply. And the tragedy is so tragic because the persons are so beautiful and inherently valuable because God loves them. And I felt a lot of distress and then also a lot of conviction around that topic, and tried to wrestle as a person of faith around my own calling. And I remember someone once saying to me when I was a junior in my career, referencing Matthew 25, where Jesus divides the sheep from the goats, saying, "How wonderful for you to have a vocation where you see Christ hungry and thirsty and sick all the time and have the opportunity to care." And I felt internally that I was a goat, that so often Christ would say to me, "I was hungry and you did not feed me. I was imprisoned. I was sick and you did not come close to me." And I felt that not in the positive, warm, fuzzy sense of being a sheep of the flock, but of being someone who has a responsibility to do more than I was doing. And I felt, initially I felt that as this distress, and I didn't know what to do with it. At that time, I was somewhat reluctant to pick up this project as an intellectual project, partly because at that time, and still I have other other projects on the go, and I'm trying to
you're doing a few things.
Yeah, trying to do the right things. And I remember saying to my wife, Kaylin, who many friends of the podcast will know, saying to her at one point, I have enough things going on. I'm trying to write and research and publish and teach on a number of other subjects. I don't think I can do addictions too. There's too much complexity, too much challenge in that topic. Excuse me. And Kaylin, again, in her superior wisdom, I think sort of cheerfully said something like, if the Lord is after you, I don't think you'll get away, or something like that. And I think she was encouraging to be patient and see how things developed. But then over time, and through the advice of some of my conversation partners, it became clear to me that this was an issue that I perhaps had some unique positioning to speak into, but also there was just such a need that even a dummy like me, maybe there's such a need that even from my vantage point, I can help the church and help all of us find ways to care and to love.
Yeah. Can you speak a bit more, Quentin, about that feeling of like hopelessness?
Mm-hmm.
Where even if you don't live in the city, even if you don't live in the downtown east side or the surrounding neighborhood, you drive down Hastings Street and you think to yourself, like what can we do?
Mm-hmm.
This is so expansive. It's so complicated, as you mentioned. I imagine there are a number of listeners right now who are thinking what I'm thinking, which is like how can we even make a dent in this program? And further to the point, if you're familiar with the community down there, you know that there are a number of good sort of services working and serving and laboring down there. And it seems like even they're having a hard time getting traction.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we come at this as Christians? What are some fundamental things that we need to kind of orientate ourselves at the beginning of this conversation with,
Mm-hmm.
to not go in hopelessly,
Mm-hmm.
to not be just sort of overwhelmed, and to not be those people who, like you said in Matthew 25, who just don't do anything because it's so overwhelming.
Yeah. One thing I read recently, St. Thomas Aquinas once said that despair is the worst of sins. And I don't think he meant worst of sins as in, despair is always the individual's fault or they're culpable for it, but worst as in the most dangerous. Despair of God's ultimate victory and the hope that we have is one of the most dangerous things that places we can come to. It's dangerous for our neighbor because it paralyzes us from helping them, from reaching out to them in love and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also deeply dangerous to us because in our neighbor we encounter Christ. And especially in our neighbor who is sick or lonely or suffering or imprisoned, we encounter Christ. And so despair has that separating effect. It separates us from the good things we can do in our communities. And so I think a couple of foundational things I would want to say for people who are listening in the church who drive down Hastings and feel overwhelmed and hopeless is do not despair. There is hope. And we believe that even in the downtown east side, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And we believe that even in the downtown east side, every tear will be wiped away by the God who hates injustice.
Yeah.
And so that's the first thing, is that when you feel that intense sense of despair or hopelessness, God blesses your feelings of moral outrage. And your moral outrage against those things are not feelings that are against God. We have moral outrage on behalf of the God who hates injustice because those persons matter so much. But that moral outrage should prompt us to action and not to paralyze despair.
Yeah, I don't know Aquinas. I know Gandalf. And Gandalf says, despair is for those, this is before Frodo goes on his quest.
Yeah.
He says, despair is for those who know the end beyond all doubt.
Right.
And so it's the same idea. Like we're forgetting the arc of history, so to speak.
Yeah. A couple other very quickly foundational things. The next thing I would say, Jesus in his teachings, as you know, he says the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. And this is something I often reflect on in my own work. There's so many beautiful persons who live in the downtown east side who have severe addictions, who need welcome and love and care and mutual relationships of mutual learning and mutual respect. The harvest is plentiful, and often it feels like the workers are few. Often we can drive down Hastings and say, where are the people who are here to help? And the first thing I would want to note about that thing that Jesus says is he doesn't say the harvest is plentiful and the workers are few, so go right now. He says, so pray.
Mm-hmm.
So pray that the Lord will provide more workers for the harvest. And so one of the necessary acts of the church is to be a praying place. And again, that doesn't mean sort of thoughts and prayers in quotes instead of action, but it means that our action doesn't begin by placing faith in our own capacity to fix everything, but our action comes out of deep trust that this problem is insurmountable for us.
Yeah. If I can just make a quick plug here, I think of, Heath Miko, who many of you would know who are listening here, who's working towards Urban Chapel on the downtown east side. And Heath would very much tell you that movement, that initiative is a result of praying, of beginning in prayer and getting the heart of the Lord on this, and then asking the Lord, as he's doing right now. And so if you're listening, asking the Lord for other workers to join him in prayer first.
Yeah.
Can I just stop you for a second, Quentin? Because one of the things that I want to make sure we don't do is narrow the discussion of addiction to the downtown east side and to Hastings Street, recognizing that addiction is more expansive. Whether you're in Vancouver or in the central Okanagan, wherever you are, like addiction is something that has touched truly every community. I was in northern BC a few weeks ago, and like addiction is rampant, not just in the city centers up there, but in the rural communities. And addiction can take many shapes and forms as well. It's not just sort of hard substance abuse, but can look like many different things. And so maybe just by way of starting us off on the right foot, can we define some terms around addiction and maybe set the parameters? Because I think that will be actually quite helpful for us as we go forward. So how would you start setting the boundaries for our conversation today?
Yeah, I really appreciate that point. And I think it's easy when we discuss addiction to jump to the extreme examples. But one of the reasons why I'm interested in having this conversation is by having a deep look at what it means to be a human person with a human mind. And everyone has, of course, a unique story and unique experience, but also there are deep commonalities. And so the phenomenon of addiction is something that we should not see as something that's just out there, and we should not only recognize in the visible extreme examples. I'm sure that there's many people listening to this podcast who have hidden addictions in their own lives and who struggle with despair at their own ability to find meaningful recovery or freedom from those things. And there's an interesting question of, we all recognize or we would all think there's some continuity between different types of addiction. But again, where does that spectrum begin and end? So the complex question of what is addiction is a really important question here. And I would emphasize, I think there are some people in this conversation, again, who say the problem seems so dire. We don't want to spend time just talking about things, we want to go and do. But I think this is a clear example where when we feel urgency, seeking clarity of our language and our mental models will enable us to do so much more effectively. And so often when people are mixed up or there's contradictory approaches to addiction, it's because stepping back, there isn't a shared model of what addiction is and where it comes from. And so all that to say, I totally agree that this defining of terms is not a mere semantic exercise. It is part of loving our neighbor by trying carefully to understand what's occurring.
Yeah. So I would just say in sort of how I've experienced this on a popular level, I use the word addiction fairly loosely. Like I'm addicted to Miss Vicky's salt and vinegar chips. And I use that language of addiction. And meanwhile, that same term is being used to speak to the most dire circumstances in other situations. Furthermore, there seems to be, even amongst Christians, a real divide in terms of how do we, like what model do we embrace when it comes to addiction? So language of disease. This is a disease versus the language of choice. A person has the willpower and the choice to kind of power through that. And in my experience, I think I've met a lot of Christians who firmly believe in both things.
Yeah.
Who are very excited. And like, this is, I believe it's a disease and the person is powerless against the forces of addiction and whatever would be involved in that position. And then the person would be like, no, this is very much something of you can choose. But what I haven't heard a lot of is people explain those how they got there from a biblical perspective.
Yeah.
And maybe sometimes there are some strands that are drawn, but it tends to be a personality thing, if I can say it that simplistically, where I'm somebody who like grew up in a home where like you change your situation by pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and doing it. And so I'm going to now say like addiction is a choice situation. Or I grew up in a home where maybe it's a bit more leaning towards the compassion spectrum of things. And so like I'm prone towards feeling compassionate towards people. I say all that to say, like, help us navigate these two things. I imagine there's some truth in both of these positions, but I think what you uniquely offer this conversation is not a third way, but a way to help us cut through these and see what is the hope of the gospel in all this. And so can you help set the landscape for us? I did a lot of talking there, Quentin. I said a lot of things. Rebuke me where I'm wrong.
No, I'm grateful for that primer, and I think I totally agree with that framing of things. So I think in the conversations around addiction in our time, there are these two models that sometimes have slightly different names, but broadly we can call versions of what we call choice models and versions of what we might call disease models of addiction. And to sort of step back and speak philosophically, those are each poles or at the ends of a spectrum of the question, how does the will relate to human behavior? So at one end of that spectrum is a system that's called voluntarism. And voluntarism says if you want to explain a given human act, the only thing you have to look at is the will. So many people who have addictions would tell you, I don't want to keep doing X, but somehow I keep doing it. And a voluntarist system would disbelieve that kind of a statement. It would say what you do simply arises from what you want. And if you say you don't want to, that's not really legitimate. And the only thing we need to explain your action is your will. I think that a simplistic voluntarist explanation of addiction is both imprecise, it's missing a piece of the puzzle, and perhaps more concerning to me, it's potentially depersonalizing in the way that it approaches persons with addiction.
So at the other end, before you go to that end of the spectrum, can you just say a bit more about why you think that doesn't fully account for the addiction's experience?
So I think, for example, a common person in our own time who defends a choice model, and I think it's good for us to note in Vancouver, if you look at public health literature or talk to professionals in Vancouver, have a hard time finding someone who defends the choice model in our own time. And most people react against the choice model for compassionate reasons that I think are good. But the choice model is still alive and well in our own time in a variety of different guises. One example of that is a gentleman who's a prominent bioethicist named Julian Savulescu at Oxford. And he advocates for what he calls the liberal model, which is a kind of a choice model. And without going into the weeds of that, he says, addictive desires are just regular appetitive desires. So everybody has appetites. Everybody wants different things. You could moralize about that, or you could not. But some people like Miss Vicky's salt and vinegar. Some people like Miss Vicky's black pepper. Some people like Sour Patch Kids. Some people like alcohol.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Some people like other, other things that sound more extreme. It might be difficult for us to relate to someone whose appetites drive them towards something that seem to be extreme or seem to cause destructive consequence in their life. But our inability to relate to that for Savulescu doesn't change the fact that those are just simple appetitive desires. And again, for Savulescu, what you do reveals what you desire. A couple of reasons why I think that is missing a piece of the puzzle, and why I empathize with people who react very strongly emotionally against that model, is that it runs directly contrary to the experience of people with severe addictions. That there's a whole mountain of research that says it isn't the same as a simple appetitive desire. But also, we know in our time, most people, for example, who have opioid addictions received their first opioids from a physician for a medical indication. Many of our patients in the downtown east side first encountered opioids when they were victims of human trafficking, or some persons were forcibly injected through horrible, tragic situations where they were obviously victims, and then they developed addiction as a response to this traumatic experience, where no reasonable person would say the thing that led to them is their own will.
Right.
And so there's a lot of complexity as soon as you start working with individual people. When you just reduce it to what they do reveals what they will.
Mm-hmm.
And if they say something else, they're just making excuses. That is, in my opinion, an inaccurate view of the individual person, but also extremely disrespectful. And as a Christian, it is really important to me to cultivate the gaze towards the other of humility and of deep understanding of the person and their experience, so as to promote healing, mutual learning, mutual growth.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
do you think, Quentin, like Paul's language in Romans about sin as a power, so not just sin as the things we do, but sin as a power that we're enslaved to, Paul's language in Romans of I know there's some debate about, is Paul writing post-conversion or pre-conversion, but I think it's, Paul's continuing to wrestle with sin. Like, I do the things that I hate, right? Do you think that language maybe goes alongside some of this critique that you're laying here, or do you think it's unrelated?
I think, to back up a little bit, and we've talked about this, as you know, sort of off air, the mapping of the category of addiction against the category of sin is a interesting project, but one that is fraught with potential errors in our language, and we have to be really careful not to speak in a way that comes across as moralizing or judgmental to persons. I do think it's interesting that what we see in our society is that the language of sin has become increasingly unacceptable in popular conversations of our society. And sin, in the Christian historical tradition, was a way of describing a universal human condition that was at once part of our nature and also the enemy of our true God-given nature. That was not just about individual acts, but was about, deep desires and habits and those kinds of things. One thing that's interesting to me is that as sin has receded from the popular conversation, so addiction has, the language of addiction has in many ways expanded. So you'll find many popular thinkers, Gabor Mate is a good example, who describes addiction as the universal human condition. And everyone has addictions. Everybody has a harm in their life as a result of their addiction. Addiction is anything that you're beholden to. And interestingly, Mate, who's not a religious person himself, to my knowledge, much of what he says about addiction could come from the early Christian tradition and things they say about sin. Addiction is a universal human condition. It's a part of our nature, but also is the enemy of our true freedom. And all of us wrestle with it in different ways. That's not totally answering your question, but I think that those lines from Paul, which are themselves debated, do point to something that sounds like the experience of many persons with addiction. The things I most want to do, I'm unable to do, and the things that I do, I hate, I don't want to do. And I often hear this story at St. Paul's, and I sit with people who say, like a guy I saw recently said to me very directly, he said, I hate down. Down is the downtown east side term for opioids, essentially. And he said, "Doctor, I hate down, I hate it, but I can't stop. Why can't I stop?" And again, this circles back to my point that defining addiction precisely is helpful to him. He's asking me, why can't I stop? What's going on in my mind when I'm experiencing this? This is part of the reason why I, like many people, can read choice model theory and get angry. Because if someone said of this man, you can't stop because you're just making bad choices, that's, in my opinion, a deeply cynical vision of what's going on in his life and in his mind. And I would want to seek a way that is more nuanced. I do think that I really believe in this idea of being a good scholar, so to speak, and a good listener. There are emphases in the choice model that I think we can pick up. And again, we shouldn't be so reactionary to say there's aspects of this that are bad and inadequate. Therefore, we should, throw rocks. We should learn from those emphases from which we can learn to nuance a more rich model.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing I would want to say from the choice models is that choice models really want to preserve a view of the person with severe addiction as a moral agent. And so Savulescu, who I mentioned earlier, is very critical of the disease model because he says the disease model says that the person with severe addiction is no longer an agent. It says they cannot choose to stop. And I must believe that they remain an agent and that their agency is incredibly potent and powerful.
Yeah, so take us to that end of the spectrum then, Quentin. And so if on one hand we have this sort of voluntarism where, you know, you can just stop. You know, it's like that, I don't know if it's a Steve Martin sketch, but just stop it. Just stop it, right? The doctor and the SNL sketch, just stop it.
Yeah.
On the other end is this sort of a determinism, right? Where we can't, like we're powerless, we're completely without agency. Talk a bit about what that model proposes and maybe the weaknesses that you see in it.
Mm-hmm. So the way into that model, to get there, I want to talk a little bit about the language of culpability. And so I think what we've said again is that to back up a little bit in philosophy, explaining human behavior is challenging. It's hard even us looking at ourselves. And this again relates to that, you know, ancient quote from St. Paul. Even looking at our own actions, sometimes our own actions are deeply paradoxical and
mysterious
confusing.
to us.
Yeah, mysterious to ourselves. Yeah. How do we explain the relationship between our reason, our will, our appetites, and our action? At one end of the spectrum that we've seen is an end called voluntarism. And voluntarism is a simplistic thing that eliminates multiple pieces of what it is to have a mind and says action is attributable to will alone. When voluntarism is applied to the human phenomena of addiction, it produces a model called the choice model. We've seen that there's some inadequacies of the choice model, both that it runs against the experience of persons with addiction and those who care about them, but also that in its more cynical mode, it attributes addiction to, you know, excuse and not enough willpower or whatnot, which in my opinion is disrespectful and inadequate. The most cynical versions of the choice model would also say that because a person is making a harmful choice, they are therefore culpable for the harms that come as a result of that choice, and therefore our responsibility to help them is less. And I'll say that again just for clarity because I know at several points. The most sort of cynical versions of the choice model would say addiction represents choice. People are culpable for the outcomes of their choices and therefore are culpable for the unforeseen harms of their addictions. And therefore our responsibility to help them is less.
So so that's something we've seen not just in this conversation, but I think we see it in medical conversations elsewhere. So if you don't get a vaccine, when you get that thing that happens to you, our responsibility as a society to care for you. So that's like a broader conversation.
And that's a common.
So it's not just, I guess what I'm saying, it's not just like because I think a lot of people would associate the voluntarism and the choice model with the political right.
Right.
And so I want to say like that logic is not just to the right alone. It's politically like all over the place.
And one really important thing to say, I think, is that outside of a community that believes in grace, you can understand how that model would be intuitively appealing for some people. As a Christian, I believe very directly that we should care for persons because they are persons, because God loves them. And we should have a cheerful agnosticism about how culpable people are for different scenarios. We should seek to engage deeply with people for why they end up in places that produce harm to themselves, so as to try to help them embrace greater freedom. But we have the freedom because we love mercy. We love grace to be agnostic about the questions of culpability. Coming back to these models. I love
celebrating agnosticism in that mode.
in that
very narrow, specific way. Fantastic. Yeah.
And this is a point to, again, just lean into this culpability thing I often make when I have conversations about culpability in my work setting, is that, you know, let's say I see in the emergency department a patient who has a heart attack. We know that what are the things that lead to heart attacks? Well, there's some factors that don't relate to the will at all. Your family history, your particular anatomy. There's some factors, risk factors for heart attacks, that may implicate your will to some degree. Exercise, smoking, those kinds of things. It is not my job as an emergency physician to look at two patients with heart attacks and say, you are 20% responsible for your heart attack and you are 80% responsible for your heart attack. That's a wrong move, both because it's completely impossible for me to truly unwind that complex causality, but also to position myself as judging your culpability at all would be something that deeply undermined the trust between myself and my patient. And so that stance of determining how culpable you are is not the stance I want to take, even if I deem you as non-culpable. My job as a physician is to treat your heart attack.
Yeah.
My job as a physician is to understand causality so as to help you in future. So it's good and right that I ask you, are you a smoker? So I can say, maybe you should consider stopping smoking. So it's not that the causality is irrelevant, but that the culpability judgment, we can actually just, we should seek to transcend cheerfully that whole debate and say, I should care about my patients who have heart attacks because they're persons. And similarly, it's not my job with a patient with addiction to try to enter into that judgmental culpability space, but rather to care deeply about them because they're a person who bears the image of God, who compels my respect and even my reverence. So then to try to circle back, sorry, I'm being a bit tangential.
No, I'm distracting you. You keep on talking.
To circle back to the disease model question. So I think there's often an underlying assumption in some versions of the choice model that help should be proportional to culpability. And the choice model adopts the more cynical end of that says persons with addictions are culpable, therefore we don't have a responsibility to help them, at least not as much as maybe others. The development of the disease model came about through a number of sort of different streams that I won't mention today. But what I would want to emphasize is that most people I know and I have read who are very invested in the disease model have become invested in that disease model out of a deep desire to help, out of a deep desire to say good and compassionate things about persons with addiction. And those persons, like myself, have felt that there are some things deeply wrong with the simple choice model and want to find a model that does more heavy lifting, both heavy lifting in terms of cognitive work, but also heavy lifting in terms of empowering us to engage with our neighbors with love and compassion and creativity. But sometimes there has been a shared assumption that culpability is proportional to help. And so if you accept that culpability is proportional to help and you want to help, then the implication is you should accept a model that implies that persons are necessarily non-culpable for their addiction. I don't know if that makes sense. If you share that underlying assumption that how much you help someone is related to how culpable they are, and you want to assert strongly that we should help, it might seem that the way to do that is to accept and advance a model that necessarily asserts a person who has addiction is non-culpable, full stop.
Right. So the idea being like, I'm going to help like someone who's powerless to do something because clearly they need my help. So like, like my kids, like I'm going to help them, in their days tie their shoes. Like, I'm not going to help that guy who clearly didn't learn to tie his shoes. You got to figure that out, man. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a very rough analogy, but does that make sense? Does that map onto what we're talking about here, Quentin?
Yeah. I think that's one strand of things that has led to the development of a disease model over the past 20, 30 odd years. And to connect that again to our philosophical spectrum, as you've said, a disease model is a determinist model. Determinism is the opposite pole to voluntarism. What determinism means is that when you explain a human behavior, the will is not involved at all. And so someone might do something that appears superficially to be an act of a will. So if you use the example of, this young gentleman who I mentioned briefly before, who said to me, I hate down. But in talking about how he uses, he does a variety of things that would seem superficially to involve his will. He texts a certain person and arranges to meet that person in a certain place. He acquires money and then exchanges the money with that other person for a given substance. He prepares that substance in very particular, often ritualized ways, and then does something that can be technically manually difficult in finding a vein and injecting it. Those things at a surface level would appear to be acts of the will. Determinism would say that's a red herring. What is producing this behavior is actually something other than his will. If you want to explain his behavior, his will has no explanatory power. And it's an interesting note, although I'll try not to ramble about this for too long, that determinism is a very old system of philosophy. Stoicism, for example, is an ancient system of Greek thought that's becoming very popular in our time again. The Stoics were determinists. They believed that, the things that drove your life were not your own will. And that was some of the tragedy of human life. If you read Greek tragedy, Oedipus Rex or whatnot, some of what can make our lives tragic is that for them, we perceive that we are free. We perceive that we have a free will. But actually, that's an illusion. That the course of our life is determined by the gods or the fates. And in our own time, we are seeing the rise of a new, what some people have called a neurobiological determinism.
Right.
Our choices, the will is an illusion. Maybe it's a helpful evolutionary illusion, but really, our lives are actually determined by things that are hardwired in our genes. And if you want to explain our behavior again, you don't attribute to the will is a red herring. That's some background. It's interesting though to note that if we've seen voluntarism as one pole, there's a disease model, there's an addictions model that corresponds to that. At the other pole, determinism, we find another addictions model that corresponds to that. And that is strict versions of the disease model that want to say good things. Persons with addictions deserve our help, and they are persons who matter, and they want to avoid the judgmental conclusions that are often implied by choice models. What they end up saying is that persons who have addictions, their will is not involved at all, and that they are victims of a brain disease. Some of this comes out of MRI and other research that says there are changes to structure and function of the brain in persons with severe addictions. And again, that's another one of the strands that led to the development of this model. But in terms of how it views the mind of the person, it suggests that the person is, with respect to their addiction, no longer an agent. And that with respect to their addiction, they are not making choices at all.
Yeah. And so our listeners might be familiar with a woman named Anna Lemke. She wrote a book called Dopamine Nation. And she advocates in that book, she's an advocate of the disease model to some degree, but she advocates in that book for like a 30-day dopamine reset. And so she's saying like, hey, like abstain from this time. And so that would be an example of sort of what you're talking about, Quentin.
Yeah. And I would say, if we're kind of moving into how do we nuance the disease model, how do we learn from it, but also see its limitations, many of the neuroscientific research that comes out of the disease model and informs the disease model is good and rich, and we should be listening and engaging with that, and thinking carefully about how to incorporate it into a robust model of addiction without, from my view, falling into a simple determinism that is, I think, both inadequate in terms of explanatory power and also potentially depersonalizing and disrespectful to the person. And those are the outcomes that I'm concerned about. An easy example of that, of course, is that many people who are invested in a disease model so deeply want to say persons with severe addictions are like me. And they're not people who are just making bad choices for no reason. They're persons, they matter, they're like the rest of us. I deeply share that instinct. But if you want to say that, and then you accept a model that says they're passive victims of a permanent structural brain disease, you actually are distancing themselves from yourself just as much. You're not saying they're like me. You're saying they have a problem that I do not have. And so in that sense, one of the weaknesses of the disease model is that it doesn't do the good work that many people want it to do with their good moral intuitions to say humanizing things about persons with addiction.
I just want to ask, I think about we're in Exodus right now. We'll soon be, where we're obviously referencing other books in the Pentateuch as a church, but I think about often, like choose whom today Yahweh puts before Israel. Like choose him to like you will like whom you will serve, right? We go to the left or to the right, and it seems like throughout redemptive history, God is putting a choice before His people. And so maybe just as a follower of Jesus and a good Bible reader, Quentin, does the disease model, does part of how you read Scripture influence some of the criticisms that you have of the disease model, or are those two things not related in your perspective?
No, I would say they're certainly related, and again. Addiction is obviously a term that began to be used sort of middle 16th century. And so that is long after the writing of the Bible. And so I think one thing that we want to do to be attentive readers of history and also of the Bible is to, when we have terms like that, to map them onto biblical concepts or biblically rooted understandings of the human mind in ways that are precise. And so not to reject new terms, but again, to seek to engage them closely with the biblical worldview. I think that text from Paul that we've already mentioned multiple times is one that Paul's not speaking about addiction, but it seems to be one that maps on to the experience of many persons with addictions. I think that the language of freedom, like freedom is another like rich notion that is obviously deeply rooted in the story of the Bible, the identity of the people of Israel as the people who were freed out of Egypt, and notably not freed unto self-determination,
That's right. Yep.
but freed away from service from Pharaoh, who is not a good master, to freedom to complete and total service of the true God, who is a good master who loves them. And that's what freedom is for them. And similarly, even looking back to Adam and Eve in the garden, I think this is another really important thing if we're talking about what freedom is for the person. For Adam and Eve in the garden, their freedom is guaranteed by their right choosing not to eat from the tree. And God says to them, of course, when you eat from that tree, you will certainly die. The language of death implies a restriction of freedom, of course. What freedom is for Adam and Eve is not simply their will. Freedom is the will oriented in the right direction, according to right relationship with God, other human persons, and the natural world, according to their given nature as creatures, not as gods or creators in themselves. And Adam and Eve, one of the fundamental things they do in choosing to eat the fruit is they believe a different version of what it means to be free. They want to be people who determine what is good and evil for themselves. They wrongly believe that extending their will beyond the God-ordained limits will enhance their freedom. And they find tragically that that actually is a restriction of their freedom. And so what it means for creatures to be free requires careful consideration of what our nature is. And this relates again and draws into what we're talking about with addiction. One of the things I believe is a limitation of the disease model is the relation of the disease model to language of recovery. So the disease model has a real hard time explaining recovery, especially recovery that epidemiological data tells us often occurs.
Epidemiological
data.
So that word means.
So people doing research on populations, persons who would meet criteria for having an addiction or a substance use disorder.
I understood that. I just didn't know. I clearly understood that. I just want to make sure our listeners also understood that as well.
So there's, especially from the United States, there's quite a bit of data that would say many people, probably most people who at one point in their life, especially with alcohol, meet criteria for a substance use disorder or addiction. Many people recover. Most people who recover do so outside of a medical model. And the disease model has trouble explaining that phenomenon. So, for example, I recently saw a patient who told me that he had previously had a significant addiction to a substance and that his girlfriend had a baby. And his girlfriend had told him, after we have the baby, you can't use anymore. And he had, after they had the baby, he had stopped. And he hadn't gone to a detox or had any medical therapy. And he, at the time I saw him, I don't know, was 14 or 16 months since he had last used. I'm not saying in any way that that's a model that will work for everyone or that, that is my proposed solution for recovery. What I would want to say is, what the disease model says when it looks at that person is it says that person experienced idiopathic remission of disease.
And by that we mean?
Idiopathic, unexplainable.
Okay.
Their disease went into remission for some reason.
Right.
And for me, I want to look at that person and say, wow. And to look into his story and his courage and his resiliency and his deep love and loyalty to his girlfriend and to his child and to celebrate.
And affirm his agency.
And to affirm him as an agent and someone from whom I can learn and I should learn and I should look across at as a neighbor, as another person, and even look up at as someone who can be a model for me and what it means to be loyal or self-controlled or loving or resilient, self-giving. All these kinds of things. And so the disease model has trouble not only explaining what happened in his life, but also potentially, from my perspective, can be disrespectful to the unique things that occurred in his heart, his mind, his family that led to those things. And I would want to seek a model that is more nuanced in its ability to be.
So can I just ask, Quentin, like someone comes in and they don't see you, but they see another medical professional. They come into the hospital and they say, hey, here's my story. my girlfriend gave me an ultimatum and I changed.
Mm-hmm.
What is the typical response of someone who has wholeheartedly embraced the disease model to someone who's undergone that kind of phenomenal change?
I think that most of my colleagues at St. Paul's would still be very warm and
Sure.
affirming.
We can take us out of the St. Paul's context if it's more helpful for you, but let's go like in some other country with other medical professionals, like who are unrelated to you in your daily work environment.
Mm-hmm. I think most people who work in addictions fields would, again, in the interpersonal space, I'd want to believe, would be very warm and affirming to the individual person and would celebrate them. Totally. Yeah. But it would introduce in their minds cognitive dissonance, and especially in the way that people chart or write around these things. Often the language of disease remission is the language that's used to describe these situations. And for me, the language of disease remission is both inaccurate and also missing a huge, beautiful piece of the story. And this again maps on to the conversations we've briefly had here about freedom. That one thing I really believe is a way that the disease model needs to be nuanced is we commonly in medicine think of diseases as abnormal states of the body or mind that can be replaced by being removed. So you have a pneumonia. The alternative to pneumonia is a lung with no pneumonia, or you have a pancreatitis. Pancreatitis is a disease, an acute medical condition. The alternative to pancreatitis is a non-pancreatitis pancreas, a non-inflamed pancreas. One of the things that happens when we think of addiction as simply a disease is we think this is a phenomenon that can be replaced with nothing. If we give people the right medicines or the right counseling, it can be replaced with nothing. Mm. Whereas, from my perspective, addiction is something that is not replaced with nothing, but is rather something that must be replaced or displaced by more free ways of engaging with God, with our neighbors, and with the natural and created world.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I feel very, very strongly about. And this connects to thinking about the church as the kind of place where, and again, this presents a high challenge to us as a body, but where addiction can be replaced with a different ordering, a different purpose, a different kind of community.
So that's a great segue into, we've talked previously about, just off air, about addiction as worship. I'm wondering if you can just talk a bit about, when we talk about worship, you mentioned Israel being freed from Egypt, not just for, self-determinism or for self-worship, but to worship Yahweh. Anna Lemke, that author I mentioned previously, I don't know if she's a woman of faith, but she said something in a recent podcast I heard her on, where we're all wired for addiction. This sounds very much like the language of worship. Mm-hmm. She talked about recovering addicts wanting intensity of intimacy. Mm-hmm. A book that we're going to reference, if we haven't already, is this book here, Addiction and Virtue, Kent Dunnington, Beyond the Models of Disease and Choice. Like, he talks in this book about, I'm just going to pull it up here. He talks about addiction by definition being a habit of extremism, that it is like an orientation, without putting these words exactly, like, of the heart. Can you talk a bit about the idea of worship and how that concept intersects with this conversation and how it might be a helpful paradigm in some respects, mm-hmm. limited in others, but a helpful paradigm as we think about this well as Christians?
Yeah, and I find this to be a theme that, again, we have to tread carefully so as to speak in a way that is humble and personalizing about our neighbors, our brothers and sisters who have significant addiction. I think to worship something is to hold it as the ordering principle of your life, to give yourself over to it with abandon and extremism. I also don't think it's an accident that our society has such a high prevalence of significant and severe addictions, when our society often has many people experiencing purposelessness and going out looking for purpose for themselves somewhere. And in that sense, this furthers my deep feeling that we need to look at persons with addiction with the gaze looking across from them and even up at them with respect, that in many ways, we have much to learn from them, and they are not living lives of bored purposelessness, but they engage in a life that is ordered by something. And the tragedy is when that thing, that small g God that they're ordering their life according to, is a evil master, and it harms them. And then what they need is to know the freedom of ordering their lives according to something or someone that loves them, that does not eclipse the other goods of their life. In the Dunnington chapter, he relays a story from a paramedic where he describes a paramedic going into a room where there was a person with a severe addiction to heroin, I think, and the paramedic is called into this room of this person who's near death, and they find this person in a room that's very very dirty, and they see this beautiful person, but obviously very unwell and frail and near death and malnourished, holding their needle up to their arm and trying to inject one more time, and the paramedic says, it was one of the most tragic things I've ever seen, and also one of the clearest examples I've seen of what worship is like.
Right.
And I think that that's quite a provocative image that, again, we want to nuance, but that we should learn from, and then understand the call, if we are to help and be a place of hope. How can we replace that kind of worship with a different kind of ordering of loves that is more in keeping with the true good for that beautiful person according to his or her created nature?
Yeah. So you talk about, I just want to press this a bit because I think this is helpful. Dunnington, again, the book is Addiction and Virtue, Beyond the Models of Disease and Choice. Kent Dunnington, you recommended this book to me. I'm sure you're going to recommend it to other people. If you can get through the first half, which I honestly skipped a little bit because it was a bit above me, but I'm looking forward to you explaining it to me, Quentin. But Dunnington writes in this that same chapter it's called Addiction and Worship. He says, and he uses language of sin and idolatry and counterfeit forms of worship. He says, for all sin as idolatry is essentially counterfeit worship. All sin is the effort to attain independently of God that flourishing integrity of self and delight that can only be attained through that just is in fact right relationship with God. Worship is our training in and enactment of that right relationship, and therefore those forms of human behavior that merely mimic the practice of worship and deceptively promise the fruits of right worship are expressions of human sinfulness. Thus, to demonstrate that addiction is counterfeit worship is to demonstrate that addiction is sin and can only be adequately understood within the theological category of sin. And so what I've heard from you so far, Quentin, and I think rightly, is a real hesitance to kind of map addiction onto sin. Is that, am I hearing you right? And yet, for Dunnington, and I want to hear you kind of interact with him a little bit here. Like he does make that mapping, not like a one-to-one mapping, but he makes it in so much as counterfeit worship and idolatry is sinful.
So one thing I think to bring these concepts into conversation with each other, the thing I would want to do is to make sure that we are engaging with a nuanced definition of what sin is. So interestingly, if we have our philosophical spectrum of voluntarism and determinism at the extremes, and we acknowledge that there are inadequate views of addiction that live at both of these extremes, and if we love persons and want to say the right things about them, we need to mediate the more challenging middle ground. I would say the same things about the category of sin. And interestingly, there's actually two heresies of the early church. One, we talked about this, one called Pelagianism and one called Manichaeism, that are voluntarist and determinist visions of sin. And so Pelagius was someone who said, sin is merely a matter of the will. If you do something that's wrong, you're always fully culpable because it only relates to your will. And moreover, you can attain perfection through the will alone.
Right.
And at the other also heretical extreme was Mani and Manichaeism that said the human will is just an illusion. Human acts are the battle in ourselves between good and evil, divine or quasi-divine powers. And so what seem to us to be wrong acts of the will are just other evil wills working through us, and we are the vehicles of those battles that are occurring
Right.
in the spiritual world. And Augustine, a lot of his work was finding a nuanced definition of sin, where sin is not just a voluntarist moralist category, but where, interestingly, he said things of sin like, sin is at once part of our nature and also the enemy of our true nature, at once part of our nature and the enemy of our true created freedom. And sin is a relational term. Sin is that which separates us from God, from other human persons, and from the natural world. And when sin is understood that way, we can understand again that to describe something as sinful is not to in itself make any culpability judgment regarding the person. And I think some of my hesitancy to bring addiction and sin conversation to each other is because most people in our environments, when they hear the word sin, they believe that that necessarily implies a judgment about culpability of the person. But provided that we can have a rich definition of sin as, again, also living in this sort of middle space, and a relational term that doesn't necessarily imply culpability, then I think I would say, alongside Dunnington, that there's nothing about addiction that is surprising to a robust Christian theology of sin. And to get into the weeds a little bit, Dunnington says that there might be other categories that might at times be more precise, categories like tragedy or something. And so he's wanting to, again, nuance that language effectively. But with all of that said, I do think that addiction is a form of ordering your life according to a highest principle that puts the other loves in your life in order according to it, that promises real goods to you. And this is a really important further nuance to some of the inadequate models.
For a second, Quentin? So it promises real goods to you.
Yeah.
And in your work from a day-to-day basis, like, what are the goods? What are the things? What are these high loves that addicts, as like all people, are seeking to find or achieve through whatever? Like what are you encountering, just like even pastorally?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question, and I think this is the deep right pastoral question when we encounter persons with addiction, is not to allow any distance between that person and ourselves, no matter how much their life is different from ours, and then not to have the first question be, why are you doing this thing that produces harm? But what good things are you seeking beneath the harmful actions that are occurring in your life? And this is true across, different things that we might refer to as addiction. And for example, if you read the literature around fentanyl, this is consistent with my experience at St. Paul's. If you ask persons very commonly, what does fentanyl feel like? People will describe fentanyl in terms of the language of human affection or comfort. And they'll say, fentanyl feels like a hug. It feels like someone spreading a warm blanket over you. It feels like an arm around your shoulders when you're alone. It feels like someone bringing you a light when you're in the dark. And they are describing the sensation of fentanyl in terms of that it offers them moral goods that are real goods. Similarly with the literature around alcohol, persons from all literature around alcohol addiction, there's the common refrains that what people are looking for in alcohol is courage or community and companionship, or they often feel separate from other people, but after they have some drinks, they feel a sense that they can, approach another person and have a kind of camaraderie with them. And so the pastoral gaze towards the person, in my view, is to not just focus on why are you drinking, because it's obviously leading to destructive consequences, but what are the goods that you're seeking in alcohol, and the good news that those same goods are available to you through a different ordering principle that will not eclipse the other goods of your life. And that's, I think, again, that alcohol is a kind of a pharaoh. It's a master, but then it eclipses your capability of doing anything. And that we know, again, from all the literature around alcohol addiction, that People who have a severe addiction to alcohol, their whole life is ordered around alcohol. Their friends are the people who drink alcohol with them. Their whole life revolves around that, and the other goods of their life get nudged away. And the good news of the gospel is that when you seek ye first the kingdom, all of these other things will be added to you as well. God is the one who made us as creatures with bodies and who made all of the moral and natural goods around us. And when we worship a true God, those other goods fall into place in our lives.
Yeah. Can we talk a bit about Quentin? So I think this is a great place to talk about the role of the church.
Yeah.
I think this is a great place to talk about the hope of the gospel. To go back to Augustine for a second, because everything goes back to Augustine or Augustine, if we must. His view of sin also led him to say, and we've talked about this before, the person who knocks at the door of the brothel, is seeking God. In that, they're seeking some sort of ordering of their life and some sort of good intimacy. To feel loved, to be known, if only for a moment. In that second, and so. The church then, as they seek to come alongside brothers and sisters in Christ, some of them who struggle very overtly and obviously, and many who struggle very quietly and secretly. When you think about how we go forward as a church and how we care for our brothers and sisters in Christ and our neighbor, I think of a few things immediately. I think of the role of community. I think about beginning from a place of compassion, which if I'm being honest, it can be hard sometimes to be moved to compassion when my default sin tendency is to harden my heart, is to go, again, this shouldn't surprise anybody who listens to our podcast, far to the choice side and be like, just do better, just try different. And yet the gospel says actually here's something more, here's a better way to walk. Talk to me about, and Dunnington has a good chapter on this too, about the role of the church. I one of the things that you said to me that I'd love for you to share more about is, Dunnington talks about addictions being related to extremism. And so these guys and gals are intensely experiencing something. They get clean, they recover, and then they maybe they get brought to a church. And as a church, we offer hey, here's one program, 1 day a week. And you can kind of be involved, you can kind of not be involved, and that actually doesn't serve them very well. Can you say a bit more about why that is?
Yeah, lots of good things to reflect on. A couple of things. I think the first thing I would say to us as the church is before you worry about someone else's soul, you should worry about your own soul. And when you find yourself, seeing examples of severe addiction, if that's on the news or driving down a certain street in your own community, if you ever find yourself thinking, how lost are those people? You should take a good hard look at yourself first and the lostness in your own life, because those people might display holiness in ways that far outstrip you and certainly outstrip me. Can
you say a bit more about that?
Yes. Again, I'm missing some of your amazing points before, but the most important story I can tell about addiction from my work at St. Paul's is that early in my career, in my first year of practice, I was asked by the triage nurse to see a patient in the waiting room of St. Paul's who had just triaged, and he seemed to the nurse to be very disorganized. He hadn't been able to identify any specific presenting complaint, but she said that he looked a bit antsy to her, was the language she used, I think. And she said, I think we should just try to see him as quickly as possible. And when I went into the waiting room of St. Paul's, our waiting room is quite small for how big of a hospital we are. And usually all the chairs are packed with people. But this gentleman was sitting right in the middle of the waiting room, and there was this huge buffer of empty space around him, and all the other patients were hugging the walls. And he was sitting in the chair, and I remember just the impression of looking at him. He was sitting in the chair and his body was rocking, and he was his feet were pounding the floor, and he was mumbling to himself, and he visibly had bugs on his clothing. He smelled very strongly, and it was intuitively understandable why other patients might be a little bit unnerved by his behavior. And I had looked at his chart, and I knew that he had a well-documented addiction to amphetamines. And I went and I sat beside him. And I put my hand on his shoulder to let him know that I was there. And I leaned forward to introduce myself to him. And in the very brief moment before I opened my big mouth, I heard what he was saying. And I realized in that moment that he was praying.
Mm.
And he was saying over and over again, he was saying, "Dear Jesus, I don't need meth. Dear Jesus, I don't need meth. I don't need meth. I don't need meth. I don't need meth." And then he saw that I was there, and we chatted, and I tried to help him. But I remember having the overwhelming sense that I should ask him to pray for me, for my own selfish soul, and for my deep need to grow, to be more like him in my approach to God and my approach to prayer. And I think we can say that without looking with rose-colored glasses, without idealizing or minimizing the suffering that he was experiencing. But we should look at a moment like that and say, if there is a ladder of holiness, if there is a ladder of good people and bad people, which I think there isn't, by the way, but if there was, he would be above me. And so before I go lamenting the problems that other people have, I should first look at myself and ask, am I living a life that is as sold out for God as the lives that persons with addictions have with respect to their addictive behavior or substance?
And this goes back to your other point, Quentin, it's about mutuality.
Yeah.
Right? And I think I've heard you talk about this. I've heard Heath talk about this really well and helpfully. But the idea of mutuality is that we're listening to each other and we're treating each other as people made in the image of God. Can you say a bit more about like centrality of mutuality in all this?
Yeah. I think one thing that also picks up on your question about the role of the church is that, especially all the literature around 12-step programs and alcohol, there's a lot of language that for persons with alcohol addictions, their addiction is displaced by their community, that it's not replaced with nothing, that their addiction is replaced with a new way of relating to other persons, with their sponsor, with their group, with people who they're mentoring. There's a community that welcomes and envelops them. And one of the reasons why a big staple of 12-step programs is people sharing their stories and sharing their progress is to emphasize mutuality. And I think oftentimes in our society, especially social media and a culture of self-assertion, people want to tell their story to assert that they are unique. And I think there's an inversion that should be present in 12-step programs and also in the church, that we share our stories to tell each other that we're the same. That although many of the features of our life are very, very different, that actually our stories of having received grace and finding belonging, we share our stories to say to the other person who it's their first time at a meeting, we are like you. And this is, again, a deep call to the church, that persons who walk into our church who have severe addictions do not have an additional problem that other persons do not have. They are not persons who are sinners in need of grace, and also persons with addiction, that all of us look across from each other as persons who have the same problem, that the world is broken, that our relationship with God and our neighbor and the natural world is fractured, and all of us need mercy, and all of us need grace. And persons with addiction is not an additional problem, and those persons need not only welcome and hospitality, but also respect, and people who are engaging deeply with them in a way that promotes mutual growth. And I've had the privilege that's more of an honor than I can say, of working in the downtown east side, of meeting hundreds and hundreds of people and hearing snippets of their stories and realizing the way that their lives display loyalty and courage and kindness in ways that far, far outstrip me in most days. And one of the things that from a moral outrage point of view, when I encounter that, drives me further into my faith, is that I believe there must be someone who sees all of those things. And so many persons with addictions, their lives are hidden, especially in the downtown east side communities, and nobody pays deep attention to their stories, and nobody listens and loves them. And I refuse to believe that all of that is for nothing. Mm-hmm. And I believe that Christ is the one who sees all of our tears, and to use the language of the poet, who catches them in his bucket, and all of the incredible acts of courage and loyalty and perseverance that are displayed by those persons. They count for something. They're seen and beheld in love and grace by someone. And as the church, we should be the ones who are the enactors of that recognition of the beauty of the other, who refuse the distance that often exists between people whose lives look very different.
Yeah. I wondered if you could talk, Quentin, like what you're saying right now to the church and about the church deals with sort of like our heart, if we could say it like that, like and our posturing as a church. I'm wondering if we can go down a rung on the ladder and say, practically, tangibly, this is how we can model ourselves, run ourselves, live our lives to better serve our neighbor who might be wrestling with addiction. Like put some clothes on this. Not that you haven't already, but just help us, live this out a bit better.
So a couple of things, hopefully practical. First of all, I think our churches need to have frequent daily offerings of places of welcome and belonging for persons who have need. And that includes persons with addiction. It might include persons who have need from a variety of other reasons. And in Acts, it describes the early church as people who gathered together in the temple courts every day. And I think sometimes we might idealize and say, they were the early church. They were so great. But maybe that was because they were weak, and many of them were weak. And they were new Christians who were afraid at times, and they needed to see their brothers and their sisters every day to be reminded of the grace of God and God's welcome of us. And that is a process that can gradually be so powerful in the lives of persons. And so if a person, for example, goes to a good AA meeting who has a severe addiction, and they're stumbling in still, a little bit hungover on day one, and their last drink was 12 hours ago, they will meet someone who will hopefully say to them, "Welcome, we're happy you're here. Here's your sponsor. You can call them anytime you want, and they will call you 3 times a day. And you should come here to this room at 7 p.m. every single day. And if you need help before that, call this number." And it's a very immersive experience. So often, and again, I think 12-step programs and their good iterations are great. So I'm not suggesting the church is an alternative to them. I think we can work together. But so often the church offers so much less than that, right? Someone comes on a Sunday morning, and all we offer them is come back next Sunday morning. And persons for a wide variety of issues, but including persons with addiction, we need to offer them something more like the people that meet in the temple courts every day, a place of daily welcome, belonging, community, a reminder of who they are that can displace their love of something else with love of God. So that's, I think, like a first big thing. And then another thing that relates to
this. Can I pause you for a second? Because I think it's worth saying. So I hear that as a pastor, Quentin. I think to myself, like, okay. And I'm trying to figure out where that fits with me. But I do think if we're to do what you're talking about, this is a whole body effort.
Yes.
And so I think maybe upstream, if we can say it like this, there might be a bit of a problem that we have to deal with first, which is a view of the church as the pastor or the priest gives me my religious goods and services. Yeah. And I go receive those on Sunday and then live my life the rest of the week. Right. And so I think related to what you're talking about is an upstream change about how we view ourselves as active members of this body, using our time, resources, gifts we've been given to serve in this particular way, in this particular moment. So I just totally. I want to maybe just speak to that because I know I feel that, and not to say that we couldn't programatize something, but I think oftentimes the thought is, okay, we need to do something and you need to do something, or we need to create this program where I think there are ways in which we can do this in an informal, body-like kind of way.
Yes. I think this is another way that the challenges related to addiction should prompt us not to see it as a problem out there, but to pick up our own task as individual brothers and sisters and members of the body. Is our immersion in the life of the church sufficient enough that it could gradually help a brother or a friend displace other, wrongly ordered forms of worship in favor of or be replaced by participation in the church and love of God?
I think that's a great word.
And if, people who don't have severe addictions, their level of immersion in the church is 2 hours on a Sunday, then it's hard to understand how their life could be a helpful model for someone who had a severe addiction. And that's why a big part of my emphasis is don't go looking out there for the problem. If you want to be part of the solution, you need to look at yourself and ask, do you present a compelling enough witness, a compelling enough place of welcome that you could be a help along the way for someone else? The other thing I was going to say to your original question was just the need for the church to ask a lot of people. And I think this is true, again, broadly true, not just for persons with addictions, but often persons with addictions do have intensity. They know what it is to be given over to something. They know what it is to live a life of purpose ordered by a particular thing. And if we want to pick up the good and beautiful things about that, then the church as a community, again, not just via programming or pastors, but the church as a community needs to offer them a similar level of immersion. People who can mentor them, people who they can mentor, ways that they can serve and love and find deep joy and belonging, and also find struggle and challenge and tasks that are hard but good and full of human dignity to wrestle with. And I just want to interrupt you for a second. We had this conversation a little bit back, not too long ago, and you said this very thing. And so recently I had a brother approach me, coming out of a recovery program and saying like, what can I do? And I think being very zealous and eager. And I think in years past it would have been like, just be here. Yeah. Just be here and enjoy. I would have set the bar like real low, but because of our conversation, I'm like, okay, I've got some things for you to do, and I've got some ways for you to take that intensity and to direct it in a particular way. And so I was just pastorally really, really helped by that, because I think my natural assumption is like, just, I don't want to put too much on you, but how that actually might not be that helpful for this particular individual. Yeah. And obviously, you're a pastor and I'm not. So I think there's, discretion and testing your relationship with that person, testing their conscience. Everyone's different. But I do think that to give a lot of opportunity to ask a lot of the person, in a sense, can communicate respect. It can communicate faith and trust in the person, but also can be a deeply helpful thing in helping them grow roots of passion and intensity. And we don't want a church full of people who, just come for 2 hours on a Sunday and leave and aren't fully immersed in the life of the body. And who better to learn from than people like this brother that you described? Again, not to place that on them as like a responsibility, but to offer it to them through the lens of, again, respect and mutual learning and growth. Yeah.
So how we think about community, our rhythms of gathering, maybe our intensity of gathering, our expectations around it, other things as we seek to put like clothes on this and like flesh this out in our respective churches, other things that might be helpful that you can think of?
Yeah, I think another thing practically is to seek to reduce the distance between persons who are very different by being really humble and flexible in how and where we engage with persons who are in those places. So, for example, someone who lives in the downtown east side, the willingness of people to go into the downtown east side to meet with them, to understand the goods of that particular community and relationships in that network, for the church not to exist outside of those geographic locations and try to pull people out of them only, but the willingness to go there to learn and like you and Heath go to UGM And I think that's a wonderful pragmatic thing that I think, again, we've talked about this as an aside, and part of the urban chapel is I would love for our churches as Christ City to have people from East Van, from South Van, and other sites to be going there to pray with our brothers and sisters who are in recovery or whatnot, going there to learn and to serve and those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Quentin, I think for someone who's been listening to our conversation so far, who are wanting to do something, I think what I've heard you say, and help me if I'm wrong here, is that a lot of this has to do with the posture of our heart. Sort of our own self-reflection in this, but also just seeing where we ourselves as people of worship have misordered our lives, and caring for people who, like us, also have misordered desires and lives. So I think I want to just say that, like, am I hearing you rightly in that 100%. Respect?
Yeah.
I think something that's also very relevant, I know I'm hit with every day as I read the Vancouver Sun or whatever periodical you choose to read. How are Christians to engage with legislation and policy making around these issues? And I know this is a probably I'm sure you were really excited about this question. I mean, it's a loaded question. Yeah. But obviously there are some implications to what we believe. Yeah. But without maybe getting to the specifics, how can we more broadly think about all the legislation and all the policies that are being passed around, whatever?
Yeah, I think that opens a variety of conversations on different debates, different pieces of legislation. And obviously we don't have time today to get into all of those. I think the first thing I would say, again, to step back and to agree with your emphasis, that I think Christians need to first ask the question, what is the church for? And I think so often with a variety of issues related to bioethics, we often see problems and we ask, what should some other body do about this? What should the government do about this? What should some other organization do about this? And I think prior to that, without having any antagonism towards those other groups seeking to bless those other bodies, but our first question should be, what is the church for? What does it mean that we're the body of Christ, the hands and feet of Christ? And without placing faith that some other body is going to do something about this, we should pick up the honest task of loving our neighbor. And even when we feel the problem seems so big, the response is to pray and to pick up the challenging task outflowing from prayer of loving our neighbor, loving the stranger, even loving our enemy. Some people have vocations that cause them to interact more with the sort of public policy side of things. And a couple of maybe very preliminary things I would say is I do think that the church can and should be a place of robust hope for persons with addictions. And I do think that in the policy debates, sometimes certain perspectives within those debates are informed by a disease model that see addiction as a permanent and irreversible condition. And what they seek through policy is then just solutions that will reduce some of the risks associated with addiction without pursuing and trying to do everything we can to promote recovery. I think as a Christian that sets the bar too low for the hope that we should have for our neighbors in the city, the beautiful persons who God created for freedom. And I could tell you lots of stories of persons who at one point in their life had very severe addictions that then come to a place of meaningful recovery and freedom and joy. And so in looking at policy options, would want not to set the bar as just we should make severe addictions slightly safer, but how can we use the tools of policy and medical guidelines and those things to do what they can do to promote meaningful recovery? That must come alongside non-medical, cultural, religious organizations serving and loving their brothers and sisters, because I think any person in medicine would be the first to tell you, no matter their perspective on this issue, that medicine can't do it all, that policy can't do it all. If we place our faith in those things, again, we're not going to, or our help is going to be minimized. So I would say, from a Christian point of view, the see law and policy in its right place. It's not our ultimate hope. But when we engage in those spaces, try to hope for more than just policies and laws that slightly decrease the risk, but engage in models that include opportunities for meaningful recovery and hope.
Yeah. I want to bring this, again, hopefully throughout our conversation, to the person. So the person right now who is struggling with addiction, maybe addiction to a substance, maybe addiction to an experience, addiction said broadly as we've kind of painted it here. What sort of pastoral hope would you want to bring to that person's life now? What would you want to say to them? You're sitting across from them, having a coffee with them in a coffee shop. I think you've spoken very clearly throughout our time, but is there anything else you maybe want to say pastorally as we close?
Yeah, I'm grateful for the opportunity to say that. I would say the first thing is that God loves you, and God knows everything about you, those things that you've hidden from others, those things that you're still hiding from others, or maybe those harms in your life that are plainly obvious to everyone and that you're deeply ashamed of. None of those are surprising to God, and God loves you deeply. And what God wants for you is healing and joy and freedom in right relationship. I would also encourage you not to despair, and despair is the worst of things because it is the most dangerous. And it is easy to despair when we are Pelagians, when we think my will is enough to free myself from this. But that will lead us to despair because our will is not always enough on its own. But if we ask for help, both from the Lord and from our community, in addition to your own agency, which is still intact no matter how trapped you feel, there is incredible power. And so if you are in the place of struggling with an addiction alone and despairing of your agency, I would encourage you to go to a brother or sister and ask them for help. And I hope and I pray that in our church bodies, that brother and sister will not begin by saying, that's so harmful or that's so bad, but will say to you, the good things that you were seeking in whatever are rightly found in God, and will help you recognize that what you were looking for in pornography or what you were looking for in alcohol, underneath the superficial things you were looking for, you were really looking for the true and the good and the beautiful. And you can find those things in a place that does not have the sort of harmful consequences like your addiction does. And so I think there is real meaningful hope for you, no matter how you feel. And last thing I would want to say, for those of you with addictions that are maybe more visible or have been more visible, who feel or have felt uncomfortable in a church, where you feel like the people in church all seem like nice, well put together people, and you're the one in there who feels like you have an additional problem. I want to apologize to you for anything I have done or we have done that have made you feel that way, like there's a distance from you, and to say very clearly that you do not have an additional problem, that all of us do have a problem. All of us need mercy and grace. All of us have sinned in what we have done, what we have left undone. And part of the Christian life is to know that as a way of deepening our love for God's mercy and grace. But you do not have any additional problem. And if anything, your journey is something that we should be listening to and learning from. And as such, we're so happy that you're part of our body.
Quentin, we've touched the tip of the iceberg today. There's a whole bunch more we could talk about, won't talk about mercifully, but could talk about. But if you're a listener right now, there is good news, not just in Jesus, but also May 7th and May 14th, Quentin is teaching a 2-week course that we're calling simply Addictions, where you're going to be unpacking some of the things that we've talked about today. And so maybe you've been listening to this podcast and you've got more questions. This just unearthed a whole bunch more in you, intellectually or even just emotionally. and you want to process this in a loving, safe community with some good guidance from Quentin and from others who are there, we'd encourage you. You can sign up for that course on our website now, May 7th and May 14th. Anything about that course, Quentin, people should know heading into it? Anything sort of by way of preamble or warning?
I think the preamble would be that the 2 weeks is again a short time,
right?
But in the first week, we're going to try to unpack some of the what is addiction questions and to look in a bit more detail than we've had the chance to today on some of the underlying question. What's the relationship of addiction to these different categories? How do we understand it as a phenomenon of the human mind that is very common in our own time and perhaps in all times? And then in the second week, we'll look to applying that precise model from a biblical worldview to the tasks of the church.
Yeah.
By way of kind of more personal preamble, one thing that I've learned and often learned from my own mistakes in engaging in issues related to ethics of the body is that we all come to these issues with our minds. And most, if not all of us, also come to this issue with our guts, with our hearts, with our own experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And even in this podcast, we're trying to navigate this difficult terrain in language, knowing that many people in our city have strong feelings about these issues and the language that should be used, trying to navigate that with grace, but also with precision, because precision is loving for persons and helping understand. And so the goal of the course is to be that kind of a place, to be a place where we have a high view of persons, where we always speak in a way that's respectful and humble about other persons, but also seeks for the good of those persons to be precise. And so if you have strong feelings, if you engage this with your mind, but also with your guts, if you listen to this podcast, you're like, oh, there's so many things I want to say or ask, or what about this? I would say that's just wonderful. That's excellent. And those guts and that passion is a love and it's a desire to help. And so I would just encourage you to come and further the dialogue as we learn and grow together.
Yeah. So if you have really strong opinions, you can email john@christcitychurch.ca. He would love to answer your emails. No, but seriously, in terms of who can come to this, like everyone can come, regardless of where you are. If you're a person prone to having disordered love in your life, if you're a person who wants to learn more, if you're a person curious, a person who vehemently disagrees or affirms what we're saying here, everyone can come to this time. Is that right?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
100%.
Quentin, thanks for being our first 3-time guest on the podcast. We'll see you probably in a year's time.
Yeah, well, I'll have another soapbox by then. Hopefully not.
Have another soapbox by then. No, but genuinely, man, it was so good to have you and so good to hear from you. And again, I feel like we're just touching like the tip of something here. But looking forward to exploring more, both in this course and perhaps in future conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for your time and for the whole team here at Here Be Dragon Studios.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe you'll be recognized next time you're traveling. Maybe I'll be recognized. You're the guy who talked to that smart guy.
No, we got to just ride the ferries all the time in hopes that we encounter that same person.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being with us, Quentin. This has been another episode of Here Be Dragons. Peace out.